broad smile covered the men's faces as they headed up the street and away from the synagogue. It had been an incredible Sabbath worship experience. The music was just awesome, much like our music was here this morning, except within their context, the cantor had sung at a perfect pitch as he led them in the most triumphal songs from the book of Psalms. The prayer of the rabbi had seemed to lift them from the cares of the world around them and right into the throne room of heaven. And the scripture, the passage that had been chosen to be read that Sabbath in that synagogue from the scrolls of Isaiah was still turning round and round in their minds, where it said there in Isaiah, the 58th chapter, "Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry, to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not turn away from your own flesh and blood. Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard." And then down to verse 13. "If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not giving your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. The mouth of the Lord has spoken." One of the classic Sabbath passages that ties together the importance of social justice in connection with the Sabbath. And so it was with delight and anticipation that the disciples, as they walked down that small road in that tiny village with Jesus, that they were amped up and excited about what opportunities this Sabbath day might bring them. What opportunities would they have on this day to set the captives free? As they headed out into the countryside, it was just a beautiful Sabbath day. The sun was shining bright in a clear blue sky, and the gentle breeze that was wafting off of the nearby Sea of Galilee kept the temperature at just a perfect level. Turning off onto a small pathway, they found themselves walking between two fields of grain on either side. And as they watched those heads of grain blowing back and forth in the gentle wind, a grumbling began in their stomachs. That way that our stomachs have a way of getting our attention and saying, "Hey, I'm still here and I would like to be fed." And so as they walked along, they began to grab off and break off some of the heads of grain. They began to rub those heads of grain in their hands, allowing the wind to blow away the chaff until they were left with just the kernel. And one after the other, they just popped one kernel after the other into their mouths until finally their hunger began to be satisfied. Now, if you ask questions of Scripture like I do, when you come to this narrative in Mark, the second chapter, where we're going to spend most of our time today as we continue on our new journey of this semester, walking through and journeying through the book of Mark, as you come to this narrative in Mark, the second chapter, at least I find myself asking the legality of what Jesus' disciples were doing. After all, this is not their grain fields. These grain fields belong to someone else. And having spent many of my formative years growing up in Georgia with two grandfathers that would self-describe themselves oftentimes as truck farmers, one thing I knew, I didn't learn much about farming to their frustration, but the one thing I learned very well about farming was that you only picked things that came from your farm. You didn't walk onto somebody else's farm and pick their tomatoes or pick their cucumbers or pick their beans. You didn't walk into somebody else's orchard and take the fruit off of the tree. In fact, if you tried that today in some of the farm areas here around Berrien County, you might be met with a loud, profanity-laced tirade of a local farmer wondering what gave you the right to pick his or her crops. You may be met by the police who are called, or worst case scenario, you may feel a few shotgun shells flying over your head, right? It's not yours. Don't touch it. And so the first question I ask myself is, what are they doing? Walking through the fields and just casually picking somebody else's grain. But in Israel, in the society of Israel, what they were doing was perfectly legal. In fact, according to Old Testament principle and law in Deuteronomy, the 23rd chapter, verse number 25, it said this: "If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to their standing grain." So here was the principle. You could not walk through somebody else's field and pull out your sickle that you carried with you and begin actually harvesting their grain. But if you just happened to be walking through their field and hunger hit you, it was lawful to enjoy some of the kernels of grain to fulfill your need to eat. With that question of legality answered, in the text, another question of legality begins to arise. Because unknown to the disciples of Jesus, as they've been walking together through this field, ever since they left the synagogue, another small group of men have been shadowing them. And now as they look at the disciples picking so casually these heads of grain, so casually rubbing them in their hands and eating the kernels, as they look at Jesus and his disciples, looks of anger cover their faces. And so if you would go with me in the text, into whatever way you brought your text with you today, turn with me to the book of Mark, the second chapter. The book of Mark, the second chapter. We're going to begin in verse number 23. The book of Mark, the second chapter, verse number 23. It begins this way, Mark 2:23. "One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along. They began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, 'Look, why are you doing what is unlawful to do on the Sabbath?'" Now, I want you to understand, this is no mild confrontation that's going on now between Jesus and the Pharisaical Sabbath police. And from now on, throughout this small time we have a chance to spend together, I'm going to use the abbreviation PSP. And when I refer to the PSP, you know I'm going to be referring to the Pharisaical Sabbath police. This is no mild confrontation between Jesus and the PSP. They are all up in the face of Jesus. Their faces are beet red with anger. They are waving condemning fingers at Jesus and at Jesus' disciples. Because in their view of the Sabbath, Jesus' disciples are now guilty of at least 2 Sabbath violations. They are guilty first by reaching out and plucking off the heads of grain. According to the PSP, they are now guilty of reaping grain on the Sabbath. And by rolling those heads of grain in their hands to get to the kernel, they are now guilty of the second work violation. They're now threshing on the Sabbath. And so here they stand, their fingers wagging at Jesus, their fingers wagging at the disciples of Jesus. And as Jesus looks at them, I can see sadness in his eyes. And Jesus offers a response that not only speaks to the concerns of the PSP, but it also speaks to the concerns of his now shamed and embarrassed disciples. And it also speaks to us today about what Jesus intended for the Sabbath to be. And so it continues on there in Mark, the second chapter. Verse number 25, he being Jesus, answered, "Have you never read that what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need, In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. As he looks into the faces of these angry PSP officers here to give Jesus and his disciples a Sabbath violation ticket, Jesus says, before you begin to write that ticket, let's take a pause and remember one of the stories from your history. And so Jesus says, remember when David, who had been anointed king of Israel, remember when David was on the run with other supporters, on the run from the demonic and determined King Saul, who was determined to bring David's life to an end. Remember that, says Jesus. And life on the run is no easy thing. When you live on the run from cave to cave to cave, one of the things you have to wonder about is where your next meal is coming from. And so says Jesus, remember that time? Remember that time when David and his men were so hungry that they came to the city of Nob, where the Old Testament sanctuary was. And they came to the high priest Abiathar and said, we are starving. Can you give us something to eat? Is there anything here that we can put into our hungry bellies? And Abiathar says, there's only one thing that's here. There's no food other than this. There are those 12 loaves of holy bread that sit on that golden table inside the first compartment of the sanctuary. Those holy, sacred loaves of bread that every Sabbath they were replaced there on the table. Every Sabbath they'd bring in 12 fresh loaves of bread and place it there on the golden table. And then they would take those old 12 loaves of bread. And because they were sacred, because they were holy, only the other priest and the close family of that priest were allowed to eat the sacred bread. For anybody else, it was anathema. It would have been unholy. But says Jesus, remember that in the face of dire human need, that not only did the anointed King David, but also the high priest Abiathar, in the midst of that human need, says these Levitical laws of holiness, when it comes to this showbread, are eclipsed by the need of David and his men to eat. And so he gave it to David and his men, and they ate that bread. But Jesus doesn't end there. He continues on. Verse number 27. And then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And so Jesus, as he looks at them, as he sees them standing there, he realizes what the PSP has done. The PSP has taken the Sabbath and they've turned the Sabbath into this cruel taskmaster into which humanity is its slave. And they've created all kinds of man-made laws, all kinds of traditions, and most of them having nothing to do with what you do on the Sabbath, but most of them having to do with what you don't do on the Sabbath. And so they've created all of these laws around the Sabbath, and Jesus is going, you just don't get it. The Sabbath is not a taskmaster. The Sabbath was meant and is a gift. It's something that God thought we needed so much at the very beginning of creation. At the very end of creation week, he said, here's my gift to you. I want to gift to you a day. And not, I want to gift to you a day so that one day out of 7 days might be the most miserable, boring experience of your week. But he says, I want to gift you the Sabbath so I can guarantee, no matter how miserable the rest of the 6 days of your week might be, I can guarantee that one day will be a day of exquisite delights and great joy. That's the Sabbath, Jesus says. It's not a taskmaster. It's a gift of joy. I wonder what experience you and I have had of the Sabbath. Has the Sabbath been an experience of serving a cruel taskmaster, or has it been the experience of delight and joy? For some of you, Sabbath may be the experience that one day out of the week where breakfast is more boring than any other day of the week. You've had eggs and hash browns and veggie bacon strips. I had to think to make sure I got that out right. Since we're taping this. Right? And it's great. And then you come to Sabbath morning. Well, here's a box of cereal. Because we're all rushing as hard as we can to make sure that we get to Sabbath school, we get to church, and God forbid we take any time with breakfast. I know we tell you that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, but on Sabbath, trust me, it's not. And I know some of you too, as students, you know this. You know that the only hope you have of breakfast is coming to one place and hoping we put at least something out there on the table. Is that your experience of Sabbath? Worst meal of the day? I have to come to Sabbath school and church hungry? Is this your experience that this right here is all that Sabbath is? Well, this is part of it, but if this is all that Sabbath is, what we're doing right now for an hour and 15 minutes together, then what am I supposed to do with the other 22 and a half hours of the Sabbath? Is your experience like many that I know been the experience when you grew up with Sabbath? That when you came home after church was done, your family went off to do lay activities in their beds and on their pillows. And you were left to try to figure out how to survive through the next number of hours, keeping yourself from being too bored and figuring out what you could do that didn't involve the TV or video games. Is that your experience? Has that been your experience of the Sabbath? Has your experience of the Sabbath been, and some of you will know what I'm talking about, and I don't know how many of the rest of you, but has your experience of the Sabbath been by keeping that really important Sabbath sundown calendar? Because we got to know the hour, the minutes, and the seconds to when Sabbath begins, and even more so, we got to know the hours, the minutes, and the seconds till this thing's over. So we religiously have it up on our refrigerator so we know when Sabbath ends. I don't know about the rest of you. I would never claim to be the smartest person on the block, but even not claiming to be the smartest person on the block, I know when the sun sets. I can tell when the sun rises, and I don't need a sunset calendar to tell me, oh, okay, now the sun's down. Oh, okay, now the sun's up. Just isn't that difficult. But if we're honest, the reason that sometimes the experience of the Sabbath is wound around that Sabbath sundown clock is because we're just somehow trying to get through these 24 hours and hoping it will end soon so we can actually have fun again. And so we begin to count down. Oh, thank God, it's now 5:29 and 50 seconds. And according to this calendar I've got on my refrigerator, at 5:30, Sabbath is over. And so we count down 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, praise God! Now we can have some fun again. Is that your experience of the Sabbath? If that's your experience of the Sabbath, then you've never experienced the Sabbath like God desires for you to experience the Sabbath. And so Jesus looks at the PSP with all of their rules and says, no, the Sabbath's not about that stuff. The Sabbath is not about being a taskmaster. The Sabbath is a gift. And by the way, who are you to tell me, who, by the way, if you hadn't guessed yet, PSB, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm the one that made this thing, all right? So who are you to tell the one who is the Lord of the Sabbath how to keep the Sabbath? If anyone, says Jesus, if anyone here between me, the disciples, and the PSP, if there's anybody here that has a right to define what you should do and what you should not do on the Sabbath, he's standing right here in your midst. But what I find incredibly interesting in the passages that we've read through is that Jesus doesn't use this opportunity. After asserting himself as the one who is Lord of the Sabbath, he does not use this opportunity, as so many of the PSB do, to then lay out, here's all the things you can't do on the Sabbath. To the point of some of it gets ridiculous, right? Where you can't go swimming, but you can wade into the water as long as it doesn't come much higher than your ankles. And boy, if you get up to the knees, you're in real trouble. Jesus doesn't take the opportunity as Lord of the Sabbath to lay out the don'ts of the Sabbath. Instead, Jesus, through not his words, but through his actions, holds out to us what it is that makes the Sabbath what Jesus so much wants it to be in our life, a joy and a delight. And so again, if you travel back into there to verse 23, notice how it describes what's going on with Jesus and his disciples on that day. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along. They began to pick some heads of grain. Number one, notice the disciples, yes, they're with Jesus, and we'll get there in just a moment. But the disciples are not just with Jesus, they're with each other, right? The disciples are there spending time in relationship with each other. And that is one of the things that the Sabbath is supposed to be all about. God says, look, I understand for 6 days of the week you have stuff going on that just cries for your attention. You have all kinds of distractions around you, and you hardly get to spend any time with your friends, with your family, and with your loved ones. But I want to gift you something. I want to gift you a day where you can put all of those distractions aside. And you can just spend that day in relationship with the ones that you love, your friends, your family. And yes, you can worship together, that's part of it, but that's not all of it. You can eat together, you can talk together, and yes, you can play together and just be with each other. This is my gift, that you get to hang out, guilt-free, on one day with those closest to you. My wife, Rochelle, who was not raised as a Seventh-day Adventist, I won't go into the whole story of how she chose to attend La Sierra, at that time La Sierra campus, Loma Linda University, now La Sierra University. When we began dating each other, she'll tell you that how she fell in love with the Sabbath is because Sabbath became this day where we got rid of everything else. I'll be honest with you, and I know this is going to make me sound incredibly lame, but most of the other 6 days of the week, our dates were in the cafeteria and then sitting in the girls' lobby of the dorm room studying. But on Sabbath, man, we can put all that aside, guilt-free. I can just throw that book away. Don't have to look at it today. And I can just spend time in my relationship with Rochelle. And she'll tell you about the time, the Sabbath, where we had just started to date, and she's dating this pastoral major. And so she thinks she has to mask herself because, I must be some type of holy man, and she needs to appear like a nun if she really wants to be in relationship with me. She'll tell you that Sabbath when we met one of my best friends down at the park to have Sabbath lunch together, and then we cranked up the tunes, and my friend and I, at the top of our voices in that park, singing into the antenna of the radio as if it were a mic, just started blasting out the songs. She was like, wow, man, this is an incredible day. I want part of this day. But Jesus shows us that not only is the Sabbath about being in relationship with others, but it's also about a time to be in relationship with Him. Because as disciples fellowship together, they also fellowshiped in the presence of Jesus. So again, Jesus says the Sabbath is a gift in time because you can put all other things aside, and in this moment in time, I just want to spend time with you. And by the way, says Jesus, you think you're busy, try running the whole universe. But I'm going to take a day off from running the entire universe because I just want to spend that day with you. And so the Sabbath becomes this delightful time of enjoying each other's company and fellowship, enjoying the company and the fellowship of Jesus, and whatever it is in your life, an experience that draws you closer to Jesus. Maybe it's reading, maybe it's praying, maybe it's walking, maybe it's being out in nature, and maybe it's listening to music. It could go on and on. But whatever it is that brings you into an experience with Jesus, that's the day that Jesus has set aside specifically for that moment. And says Jesus, if you begin to understand that the Sabbath is about relationship with others, the Sabbath is about relationship with me, then you begin to discover what the Sabbath is supposed to be, a joy and a delight. I know I've shared this story with some of you previously in the context of the power and the passion of Jewish worship, but I share it again here in the context of the Sabbath. In 1995, I was spending some time in the Middle East, and so I had gone on a Friday night, just as Sabbath was beginning, down to the Western Wall. And as I arrived at the Western Wall, where all of the men and the women and the children were gathering to welcome in the Sabbath, as I walked into that section of the Western Wall, here was a group of men that clasping hands, dancing as they went around in a circle, singing a joyful song, welcoming the Sabbath, right out of Psalms 92. And as I neared that group, suddenly they reached out and grabbed me, and I said, well, I'm not Jewish. And they said, well, you're at the Western Wall on Friday night, so you are tonight. And they grabbed me and pulled me into the circle, and this rhythmically challenged pastor held their hands and attempted to dance with them as we went around in a circle, singing at the tops of our voices that Sabbath was here. That's what Sabbath should be like. It should be a moment where we're wanting to sing at the top of our voices, smiles on our faces, and yes, dance in the presence of the Lord of the Sabbath. But Mark takes us one step further into our understanding of this day of delight that the Sabbath is supposed to be. And we're going to wade into Mark, the 3rd chapter, just a little bit. I talked to my friend and colleague, Pastor Susan Zork, because she's going to be handling chapter 3. I said, can I go in just a little bit? She gave me permission. All right, so verse number 1. Another time, that being Jesus, he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked, what is it lawful to do on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? But they remained silent. Can you see the scene? Jesus at another synagogue on a Sabbath. And as those in the synagogue raised their hands in prayer and in worship, it's not hard to spot this one man, the shriveled flesh on what presumably is a hand, the gnarled fingers twisted and distorted. And as soon as Jesus' eyes fall on that hand, Jesus begins to walk towards that man. And Jesus is not unaware as he walks towards that man that the eyes of the PSP are riveted on him. He knows why they're looking at him. He knows the consequences of the action he's about to take, but Jesus simply doesn't care. And so he walks up to the man. He asks the man, do you want to be made whole? Of course. And instantly, Jesus heals that withered hand. And now you can see again the red and angry faces of the PSP, not rejoicing in the fact that the man had been healed. In fact, they thought that Jesus shouldn't have healed him. I mean, after all, this is not going to take his life. I mean, maybe if he was having a cardiac arrest in church, Jesus might ought to do something. But his hand's withered. He's lived for 20 plus years with a withered hand. Can't he live for one more day? Just have Jesus tell him to come back on Sunday and see me. No, says Jesus. On the Sabbath, there's nothing more important than human need and reaching out and connecting to human need. And then it amazes me what the PSP does next. Verse 6. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Isn't that amazing? They're upset with Jesus because Jesus has dared to heal a man's withered hand on the Sabbath. And instead of rejoicing in that healing, they sulk away as if somehow Jesus has done something inappropriate. But while they find Jesus' healing of that man to be inappropriate, apparently it's a lawful Sabbath activity to go and find enemies of someone and spend the rest of Sabbath afternoon plotting their murder. Makes sense, right? In his book, just a wonderful little book called A Love Song for the Sabbath, written by one of my colleagues, Richard Davidson at the seminary. Must-have book, best book I've ever read on the Sabbath, bar none. He didn't know I'm saying this, so he didn't ask me to give him free advertising. Great book on the Sabbath. He tells the following story. A man had just moved into a small community with a small Adventist church. And just weeks after moving there, the Adventist church decided to hold an evangelistic crusade. And so he showed up on the first night of the evangelistic crusade to be supportive to his new church. And when he walked into the church, there was hardly anyone gathered there. Certainly no one from the community had come. And there was just a smattering of church members that were fulfilling their duty by showing up. And as he sat there, a plan began to conceive and take shape in his mind. For the next year, every Sabbath morning or every Sabbath when he came back from church, the man happened to be a plumber, he would take his toolbox and throw it in the back of his truck, and he'd begin to drive throughout the community, asking God to impress upon him those that might need his services. And when impressed, he would stop by that house, he would knock on the door, he would say, this may sound funny, but I have this feeling you have some plumbing needs, don't you? And different homes, they'd say different. Well, yeah, I mean, our tub's been backed up for weeks. Our toilet doesn't flush anymore. Our sink water's not running. They say, well, will you mind if I fixed it? And in surprise, not thinking about any perhaps further ramifications, they would allow him into the house and he would fix the tub or he'd fix the sink or he'd fix the toilet or a combination of those. And invariably, when he would be ready to leave, the person in the house would say, I thank you so much, but I am so sorry. The reason we've never gotten these problems fixed is because we couldn't afford to pay for a plumber, and we can't afford to pay for you. And with a smile on his face, he would say, there is absolutely no charge. This is God's gift to you on his Sabbath day. The Sabbath is a day in which we can find delight and joy if we get past all of the do's and the don'ts and the don'ts and the don'ts. It becomes a delight and a joy when we begin to embrace it as the relational day it is. Relational day with each other, relational day with God. But even further, we begin to discover the joy and the delight of the Sabbath when instead of working for our own profit and good, we work for the profit and good of others. A year later, that church held another evangelistic series, and it was full to overflowing because people in that little community wanted to know what kind of church has a plumber in it that drives around on Saturdays doing free plumbing work. May we today beginning on this Sabbath day and the Sabbaths that will follow again and again in the weekly cycle. May we begin to discover the exquisite delight and the great joy that Sabbath is meant to be. May we come to a place where we can discard everything that would make this day bitter and boring. May we come to a place in our experience where we take the guilt-free day of the Sabbath to put all other things aside and draw closer in relationship with each other and with God. And may we come to that place on Sabbath where our community knows us not as the strange people that somehow fill up their church parking lot on a Saturday. I mean, after all, who does that? But may we become known as the people who spend their Sabbath seeking to make the community in which they live a better place. May we today, and may we always, learn what it truly means to dance with the Lord of the Sabbath.